Mr. Rusty's New House by John Patience. One morning, Rufus Rusty woke up with something dripping on his forehead. Plip, plip, plip. "Oh no!" cried Rufus to his brother Redvers, who was in the lower bunk. "The roof is leaking." "Never mind," giggled Redvers. "I'm quite dry down here." Rufus leapt out of his soggy bed and ran to tell his mother and father. But they were already running around with pots and pans trying to catch the rain, which was leaking into their bedroom. It was the same in Dusty's room. "It's hardly worth having a roof at all if it's going to leak like this," said Mrs. Rusty. Eventually, Mr. Rusty managed to find enough pots and pans to catch all the drips. Then, after eating his breakfast, he set off for work at the railroad station where he was the engine driver. As he left, Mr. Rusty closed the front door behind him, and it fell off. All day long, things went wrong with Mr. Rusty's house. Soot fell down the chimney, the windows stuck and wouldn't open, and Mrs. Rusty fell through the floorboards, which had become rotten. "Oh, I wish we had a new house," she moaned. Late that night, there was a terrible thunderstorm. Lightning flashed around the sky, and it rained cats and dogs. In the morning, the River Ferny, which had become swollen with all the rain, overflowed and rushed down into the hollow where Mr. Rusty's house stood. The water crept up higher and higher until at last Mr. Rusty and his family had to climb up onto the roof. When Mr. Periwinkle the postman came riding down the lane and saw Mr. Rusty and his family all perched on their cottage roof, he was so surprised that he fell off his bicycle. "Don't worry, Mr. Rusty," cried Mr. Periwinkle, scrambling to his feet. "I'll ride over to the fire station and get Alfonso Duff and Mr. Bouncer. They'll know what to do." The Fern Hollow firemen soon arrived and began the rescue operation, extending the ladder on the top of the fire engine all the way across the floodwater to the Rusty family's roof. Rufus and Redvers thought it was all great fun until they both lost their balance as they were climbing along the ladder and fell in the water. Mr. Prickles had been watching the rescue, and realizing that the Rusty family would now have nowhere to live, he invited them to stay with him for a while. The kind hedgehog soon made a nice warm fire, and Mrs. Prickles gave each of the foxes a bowl of steaming hot soup. Later in the day, Mr. Rusty heard a lot of noise outside Mr. Prickles' house and went outside to see what was happening. A little further down the lane, Brock Gruffy and a few other animals had started to build Mr. Rusty a new house. Mr. Rusty set to work himself at once. There was plenty to be done, hammering and sawing, cement to make and bricks to lay. It was a lucky thing for Mr. Rusty and his family that they had so many good friends to help them. It took quite a while to build the house, but each day a little more was done. The walls grew up and the roof was put on. The tiles were laid and the windows and doors were fitted. And at last, Mr. Rusty's new house was finished. Of course, all the furniture from the flooded house was useless, but Mrs. Rusty's friends each gave her bits and pieces from their own house. And Mr. Chips the woodman arrived with lots of tables and chairs and cupboards which he had made. That night, Mr. Rusty held a housewarming party to thank all his friends for their kind help. It was a very jolly party. The air around Mr. Rusty's new house was filled with the sound of singing and laughter, and the lights of the windows twinkled merrily in the darkness.